It was barely visible, a tiny piece of DNA sitting on the snap of a knife sheath. At first glance, it looked insignificant, but that single clue would eventually expose the man responsible for one of the most shocking crimes in recent American history. The question was simple. How did investigators go from having absolutely no suspect to identifying Bryan Kohberger? The answer unfolded through a trail of evidence that became tighter and more damning with every discovery. And it all began before dawn on November 13th, 2022. The house at 1122 King Road was quiet. Inside, 4 University of Idaho students had returned home after a Saturday night out. Madison Mogan, Kaylee Goncalves, Zana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin. By morning, all 4 would be dead. The murders stunned the small college town of Moscow, Idaho. There were no immediate arrests, no eyewitness identifying a killer, no obvious motive. Investigators were facing one of the most complex homicide investigations the community had ever seen. And for weeks, the case seemed frozen. Then, detectives discovered something outside the house that would become the first major break. Not a person, a car. Security cameras from around the neighborhood had captured a white sedan moving through the area during the critical hours of the murders. The vehicle appeared again. And again. And again. It wasn't simply passing through. It was circling. Investigators tracked its movements through multiple camera systems. The car entered the neighborhood several times before the murders. Then it returned once more shortly before the attacks. Minutes later, it sped away. Whoever was behind the wheel had been at the scene during the exact window when the killings occurred. But there was a problem. The driver couldn't be identified. All investigators knew was that they were looking for a white Hyundai Elantra, and at that point, thousands of similar vehicles existed. The car was important, but it wasn't enough. They needed something more. Then they found it inside the house. Near one of the victims, investigators recovered a leather knife sheath. It shouldn't have been there. More importantly, it shouldn't have been left behind. The sheath appeared to belong to a military-style knife, but the knife itself was gone. Whoever committed the murders had taken the weapon. Yet somehow, they left behind the sheath. That mistake would change everything. Forensic analysts examined every inch of it. Most of the surface revealed nothing useful. Then they focused on the metal snap. There, they found a tiny amount of DNA, just enough to build a profile. Not enough to immediately identify a suspect, but enough to create a path forward. The killer had left something behind. The question was whether investigators could figure out who that DNA belonged to. The answer wouldn't come from the crime scene. It would come from hundreds of miles away. While forensic testing continued, detectives kept working the vehicle lead. Law enforcement agencies across the country were alerted to look for white Hyundai Elantras matching the one seen near King Road. Then an investigator at Washington State University noticed something. A white Hyundai Elantra registered to a graduate student. His name was Bryan Kohberger. The vehicle matched the description investigators had been searching for. But a matching car alone wasn't enough. Thousands of innocent people owned white sedans. Detectives needed to know whether Kohberger fit the timeline. So they started digging. What they found only raised more questions. Bryan Kohberger lived in Pullman, Washington, just minutes from Moscow. Phone records showed a device associated with him moving around the area. Investigators began reconstructing its movements. The data suggested repeated trips near the victim's neighborhood in the months before the murders. Not once, not twice, multiple times. The pattern caught detectives' attention. Then they looked at the night of the murders. According to investigators, Kohberger's phone stopped reporting location data during the critical period when the attacks occurred. Hours later, the device became active again. The timing was impossible to ignore. Still, phone records are only part of a story. Investigators needed something stronger, something that could connect the man, the car, and the DNA. That's when surveillance began. By December, investigators were quietly watching Kohberger. Not in Idaho, in Pennsylvania. He had traveled home for the holidays with his father. The white Hyundai Elantra was there. So was Kohberger. But detectives weren't ready to make an arrest. Not yet. They wanted confirmation. And that confirmation would come from something most people throw away every day. Trash. Investigators collected garbage from outside the Kohberger family home. Hidden among the discarded items was DNA. Testing revealed a critical connection. The DNA recovered from the trash belonged to the father of the individual whose DNA had been found on the knife sheath. The statistical odds were overwhelming. The person who left DNA on the sheath was almost certainly Bryan Kohberger. Suddenly, everything began lining up. The vehicle, the phone records, the surveillance footage, the DNA. Each piece alone might have raised suspicion. Together, they formed a powerful chain, and investigators knew they were ready. In the early morning hours of December 30th, 2022, law enforcement moved in. A tactical team surrounded the family home. Kohberger was taken into custody. The mystery that had gripped the country finally had a suspect. But even then, questions remained. Would the evidence hold up in court? Would investigators be able to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt? Those answers would take years, and the evidence continued to grow. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they assembled a case built almost entirely on forensic evidence, digital tracking, surveillance footage, and timelines. There was no dramatic confession, no eyewitness placing Kohberger inside the house. Instead, investigators relied on something often more powerful: a trail. Every movement, every record, every mistake, leading back to the same person. Then came the moment that changed the case forever. After maintaining his innocence for years, Bryan Kohberger entered guilty pleas to the murders of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, the clue that transformed a mystery with no suspect into a case with a name. Because in the end, investigators didn't solve the murders with one piece of evidence. They solved them by connecting dozens of pieces together. But if one mistake changed everything, it was the object left behind in that house: a knife sheath, a trace of DNA, and the clue that led investigators straight to Bryan Kohberger.